תתהלך בארץ בתרמיל ובמקל, וודאי תפגוש בדרך שוב את ארץ ישראל.
Hi, it's Aryeh Green again, author of My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land. And we're here on Melitz Radio and video with more Tales from the Trail. This is actually the 10th segment, which will be our penultimate segment. Next week we'll kind of wrap it all up. For those of you who've been following the first 9 segments, you'll know that these are basically some different both anecdotes from hiking the Shvil Yisrael, the Israel National Trail, and a description of the main lessons that I learned while hiking the trail, which helped me to heal, to recover from what was a devastating divorce, a personal challenge that really took my life off of its track, as it were. And I hiked the trail a number of years ago to, well, literally get my life back on track. We're here today. I've said each time that we've done this that each one is a little bit different. And we're here today on the shores, on the edge of the Yarkon River in Tel Aviv, which I'll describe shortly. And we're walking along the Yarkon, along the Israel National Trail. If you recall, if you were with me last week, our journey took us to the Sharon Beach, just north of Herzliya, where I spent my last Shabbat before finishing the hike, before finishing the trek, which was, if you've been following along, 8 weeks, all alone, 1,000 kilometers, about 700 miles on the Israel Trail. And we have basically covered most of that journey and the reflections, the lessons that I learned, the different elements of the learnings that helped me to, as I said, heal from my very difficult challenge to meet the difficult challenges that I was facing. Now, if you're listening to this on the radio, and I invite you to join us on the video, because one of the ideas in this whole series has been to share parts of the trail with you. And here we are on the Yarkon River, on the trail, passing by families, having picnics, hearing the birds in the background. The Yarkon River is one of the treasures of Israel and the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, which too few people actually know about. It was for many, many years extremely polluted and not really usable, not for boating, let alone swimming, of course. And it has been, and had been, maybe a decade ago, a little bit more, rehabilitated and turned into what you can see here behind me, a beautiful oasis. I'll even show, walking along with me along the trail. Let's see what I'm looking at. I'll come across at some point a trail sign, which I'm happy to show you, because if you've been, again, joining me on this virtual journey, you'll know that seeing the trail signs is kind of like seeing an old friend, like Wilson, the soccer ball in Tom Hanks' movie Castaway, where he talked to the ball. I talk to the trail signs. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier segments. When you're hiking alone, sometimes you lose frequently you lose the trail. And when you see the trail sign, here's one coming up, it's like seeing an old friend. Oh, great, I know that I'm on the right path. So here we are on the Yarkon River, basically, literally recounting the steps that I took. Here's the trail sign on a little trash can. And we're retracing those steps that I took at the beginning of my last week on the trail. Now, the trail itself, and by the way, for those of you listening or watching, yes, it's very amateurish. The sound quality is amateur. The video quality is amateur. I do have a tripod, which I'm carrying with me, which I'm actually holding in my hand, which is why you feel a little bit of bouncing, because I'm trying to hold it out and not let it be hit by the ground as we walk. I will stop up ahead in order to have our conversation. But as usual, I wanted, for those of you listening on the radio and those of you watching on video, I wanted you to have a feel of what it's actually like walking the trail. And as I have said in previous episodes, I am so grateful to Rav Ori Ailon and to Ami Infeld for giving me the opportunity, the reason, the excuse, as it were, to return to the trail, to enjoy these little outings, to walk along the trail again. So I'm walking along the Yarkon River, which I said was a treasure. Now people, I think the best way to understand it is it's kind of Tel Aviv Central Park. And don't get me wrong, it's not nearly as large. It's a very narrow swath of land. Along here you can see the Yarkon to my side. On the other side there's maybe 100 meters wide park, green area. And on this side also about 100 meters worth of park, bicycling paths, walking paths, and what have you. Now, it's really been developed over the last 10 years or so, and it's really become a bit of a paradise. You cannot imagine walking from where I just was, the Namal, the port of Tel Aviv, which was the old port, which has been also developed, turned into a really beautiful, pretty upscale shopping and restaurant area. And walking on the trail, coming down the coast from where we were last week on the Sharon beach where I spent Shabbat, via Herzliya, northern beaches of municipal Tel Aviv, you suddenly come into what is north but still somewhat central metropolitan Tel Aviv. You can see here behind me some of the buildings. You can't really see the taller buildings of the Tel Aviv area because they're hidden behind the trees. But we are in the middle of the city. And that's part of the trail too. The different kibbutzim, moshavim, small villages and towns, Arab villages, Bedouin villages, cities like Gadara, walking through Caesarea, of course up to and through the outskirts of Jerusalem. Part of the Israel Trail is not only the outdoors and the obviously enjoyment of hiking the outdoors, but actually, as I talk a lot about in my book, the people you meet, the culture, the reality of modern Israel, the miracle of modern Israel, and the development of our cities. Well, this is one of the nicest parts of the trail for another reason. Well, for me. Today we're going to talk about goals, sense of purpose. I'm going to set myself up here in a quiet area by the river. And I have to say that it gives me great pleasure to kind of relive and re-explore some of the issues that I was thinking of, that I was contemplating as I walked this particular path. I said it was my last week on the trail, so I spent Shabbat on the Sharon beach where we were last week, and then I spent a night at the Canadian ambassador to Israel's residence in Herzliya, an old friend of mine who graciously afforded me the opportunity to stay in what was basically luxury. You can imagine somebody hiking on the trail, finding themselves in a beautiful, luxurious villa in Herzliya Pituach. And then walked down the coast. I was actually very surprised how it took only a few hours to get from Herzliya to Tel Aviv and then to walk here along Tel Aviv. And one of the nicest things, before I get into the specifics that I want to talk with you about, one of the nicest things, if you look here, this is the Yarkon. And the Yarkon River, as I said, was polluted and has since been rehabilitated. But what's amazing is, who would have thought you would have this almost jungle-like experience and environment in the midst of Tel Aviv? Now, I want to say, maybe 2 hours after leaving the Namal, 2 hours after leaving the port of Tel Aviv, I found myself in what I guess can only be called the wild. I mean, it's just strange. You're talking about 2 hours of walking in that direction, walking east along this kind of northern patch of Tel Aviv, and all of a sudden, I'm surrounded by fields. The Yarkon itself kind of meanders in a strange but lovely kind of winding snake-like pattern where it backs onto itself a number of different times. I hope you can hear with the wind, lovely, lovely breeze. I'm going to set the camera down so we can talk for a bit. But at that point, wandering just a few hours walk out of Tel Aviv, it was literally like I was out in the wild with brushes along the sides of the river. No benches, very few signs even of the Shvil, but still really kind of miraculous to discover something where, in fact, I had worked for a number of years right near the Yarkon, and I didn't even realize it. When I was hiking this part, I felt I was in the wild. I thought it was amazing that I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I looked over to my left, and suddenly on a rise, I looked to the trees and I saw my old office space in a place called Ramat Chayal, Ramat Chayal neighborhood in the northern eastern reaches of the city. In any case, walking along the Yarkon for me was one of the highlights of the trail, and there's a reason for that. If you followed along so far, you'll know that I've spoken a lot about a number of issues that became important to me as I worked through the different difficulties and the challenges that I was facing, as I've discussed. And as you know, I'll just repeat the words for those who haven't followed in any, all of the different segments. I learned humility in the desert. I learned acceptance in meeting some of the physical challenges of the trail. I learned a sense of gratitude, or if not learned, at least reinforced in myself, a sense of gratitude for all the blessings in my life, and also in particular the privilege to hike the trail. I have the ability to do so. Even gratitude for my marriage of 28 years, even though it had been broken up through no choice of my own. It turned my world upside down. And I also discussed a few weeks ago the issue of forgiveness, and I came to a very deep sense, not just intellectual, but heartfelt forgiveness of my former wife for making the decision she did to break up our family. The thing is, though, in this last week of the trail, I kind of realized, I had set myself a goal, which was to hike the trail, and I was doing that. I was almost finished. I had different goals. I had a goal every day to get to the night camp, to find the water that I had buried, or to get to the end of that particular day's trek. Obviously, at the end of each week, and the end of the trek itself was a goal. But I had set myself this goal to hike the trail, and it occurred to me actually on that Shabbat that I was at the Sharon Beach, where I was last week with you. It occurred to me that, you know what, Laurier, you're going to come home in about a week. And you're going to have done something amazing. You've hiked the entire 1,000 kilometers of the Israel Trail, all alone. Did I mention I had a 50-pound pack on my back? And you did it. And that's amazing. And when you get home, you're still going to be alone. You're still going to be divorced. And even if you've reached a level of acceptance of that reality, which we talked about a number of weeks ago, that really kind of, you're back where you started almost. And that got me to thinking about the importance of having a set of goals, a purpose in life. Now, I studied psychology as a first degree. I spent years reading all sorts of different works, and one of which was influential on me in my early years, and that was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And without going into detail, I highly recommend the book. I talk about it in some detail also in my book. The idea that Frankl introduced, or that he discovered and turned into a whole theory of psychology called logotherapy, he discovered in the concentration camps, in the tragedy and the horrors of the concentration camp. What he discovered was that those with a reason to live, those with a sense of purpose, to give their lives meaning, were more likely to survive. And it's a very powerful argument, and I don't, of course, at any rate, in any level, compare my difficulties in getting through my divorce with those that people went through, of course, in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. But the concept when I was younger, and then again as I was hiking the trail, really spoke to me. The importance of having a purpose, a set of goals to give our lives meaning, where Viktor Frankl talks about people who said, I have to get out of these camps to find my wife. I have to get out of these camps to tell the story. I have to get out of these camps because I think I found a cure for cancer. For himself, he talks very specifically that he, developing this theory called logotherapy, gave him a goal to survive and to get through in order to then share that with humanity. And the truth is, for me, having forgiven, as we talked about a few weeks ago, looking towards the future, being at the sea, which opened kind of, and the sea does this, I talk about this also in the book, it kind of, looking at the expanse of the sea gives you a feeling of endless possibilities. And I really felt in this last week I was walking home, heading east and south towards my home in Beit Shemesh. As I mentioned before, I organized the trail such that I could actually walk home. I wasn't going to end the trail in the north and then take a bus or a train or have somebody give me a ride. I was going to walk home this last week. Having this feeling that I was reaching the end. Understanding the possibilities really that were open for me. I started to think about how those possibilities, how the exploring of those possibilities have to be anchored in some set of overriding principles, some sense that was leading towards a goal, or goals which make life worth living. Now, obviously, as I said, I had physical goals on this trip galore, climbing to the top of a specific mountain, reaching the destination that I'd planned for that particular day, obviously finishing the trail itself. But I think just as clearly, I also had goals, which was the reason for the hike itself. Following my divorce, I had new goals to set. I wanted to get my life back on the trail. I wanted to get my life back on the track, as it were. I wanted to reach various other personal goals and aspirations that I'd set for myself, relating to family, community, my professional or career moves, and more. And it's the funny thing is, there was also something kind of overwhelming with walking through Tel Aviv, which is such this bustling mass of humanity, as opposed to simply being out in the middle of nature, that I recognized that everybody's walking somewhere, everybody's leading somewhere. The cars are going, the bikes are going, the people passing me on the trail, very, again, sociable, because I'm in the center of the population of Israel, not out in the middle of the desert at this point. I really came to an understanding that we all have this sense of a need for goals and what have you. And so I was ruminating more and more about Frankl's principles, and I started to make them my own. And I want to describe a little bit how I did that. In Frankl's understanding, and he talks about this obviously in great detail, I'm just summarizing here very simplistically, a person can arrive at a sense of meaning for their life by having goals, aspirations, etc., in three different ways: acting, or creative activity, acting or creating, in a love relationship, which gives our life meaning, and personal growth or change. And the truth is, that's what I was doing. I was walking, which was a continuous act, creative perhaps less so, but I was definitely acting. I was moving away from one love relationship, but I at least in my mind had ideas of anticipating another as a possibility. I was certainly growing and changing personally. And I kind of changed his language. I call it doing, loving, and being. He says acting, relationships, and personal growth, and I call it doing things, loving, which is obviously the relationship issue, and being, existing and being and growing in our being, which is obviously personal growth has to do with our existence. We all of us, I think, facing challenges and transitions in our lives, whether loss of a job, loss of a loved one, changes in living standards, other hardships, and now we're going through this whole Corona period, which is obviously wreaking havoc on many of us in terms of both relationships, jobs, income, and what have you, and all the other hardships that we face in our lives. We all can actively pursue different kind of whatever goals give our life meaning. Actively developing our skills and contributing to our family, our community, our nation. Working on relationships with our children and grandchildren, our spouse, partners, friends, what have you. Looking to constantly improve ourselves. And so for me, I mean, at whatever age, these three elements, doing, loving, and being, make life worth living. Obviously, it takes effort. It takes effort, conscious effort, and focus to establish and then pursue those kind of goals, and even more to achieve them. But without them, all the humility and the acceptance and the gratitude and the forgiveness that I learned and have spoken with you about are worth little in the end, I think. And so for me at this point, with those ideas in my mind, walking through the north of Tel Aviv, I started to think about my life's goals. And I'm going to start walking again as I share some of them with you, because there's, just reaching down to pick up my bag, there's a specific one, this is a spoiler alert, that I'm going to enjoy sharing with you as we near the end, and I think you'll understand then, that will help you to understand why this particular part of the trail is so enjoyable for me and so nice for me to be able to share with you. I'm unhooking from the tripod so we can walk a little bit more comfortably and smoothly together. I was walking, as I mentioned, in an eastern direction towards home. And as I mentioned, I was thinking all along of what kind of goals I want to be setting for myself. And I'm only going to share a few of them with you now, and obviously very relatively shallow level, but just to share with you so you can get a feel for what was going through my mind. And yes, if you're watching the video, if you're not, I'll describe for you on the radio. As I walk now down the Yarkon, there is a family, or it looks like a bunch of friends, boating down the Yarkon behind me. I'll stop and try and show that as I talk a bit more. Aside from the goal of finishing the trail, moving on with my life, I started to set myself other goals. Goals relating to the family. I've always been very close to my children, thank God. And I've always given them great priority. And I've tried to balance issues of discipline and independence and love and cherishing them. And I dedicated myself as I walked along the Yarkon here to be even a better father, more actively involved, spending more time and really making that a priority, as my grown children were, one of them already married, one with a serious boyfriend clearly on the way to marriage. I've discussed a few times meeting them. I think next week in my last segment, I'll talk a little bit more about the trail angels that I've mentioned a few times, and the times that I met up with my daughter and her boyfriend at the time, now husband. There's no question that was foremost in my mind, partially because of the incredible support that my children, all of them, all three of them, had given me through the course of of the difficulty of my wife's decision to leave. Beyond that, if we're already talking about being grateful for support, the support that I received from friends not only made me so grateful, but also inspired in me a commitment to make sure that I was there for my friends when they needed me. I have been in the past also. These were not new concepts, but they reinforced, especially within the context of my being divorced and being single in a community where most of the families are married and have families, the issue of eating Friday night dinner alone, of making sure that those who are alone don't just get a standing invitation, but actually get a phone call once every week or two to say, will you join me for Friday night dinner? Will you join us for Shabbat lunch? Do you want to get together for a beer on a Tuesday night? Even if the answer is no, reaching out and recognizing that even though all of us can and do in different situations survive on our own, that reaching out is so very important. I had some professional goals that I was setting for myself as I walked here along the Yarkon. I had spent decades working on behalf of Israel. The last decade spent running a small project called Media Central, a project of honest reporting where we were providing services for the foreign press who were based in or visiting Israel. And I was very pleased with the success of the program, but I was also frustrated because as a service provider, we had to remain objective. And we had a terrific reputation for objective provision of services to help the foreign press report more accurately from the field. But that meant that I had to be very, very soft-spoken, very diplomatic. I could never really advocate a specific policy prescription for Israel. And I had seen over the past decade, well, over the past 35 years of living in Israel, how the world's media and political echelons, church leaders, academics, of course, the campus being the worst environment, had turned reality upside down. And I really felt the need to break out of that role of the diplomatic service provision, while still important, because accuracy is Israel's best ally. The more any journalist knows about the reality of Israel, the reality of on the ground, the real legal status of the territories, if you will, the history of the conflict, the history of the Jewish people's connection to this land, the more any journalist knows about Israel, warts and all, including all our mistakes and perhaps mistaken policies, the better we look. But having said that, having been dedicated to this issue of accuracy for so many years, I really felt I wanted to change. And one of the things that I wanted to change was I had already started to help a friend who had been working to bring renewable energy projects to Africa. And I had helped him, my good friend Yosef Abramowitz, to start a new company and to build that company out. And I said to myself as I was walking here along the Yarkon, I think that that's what I would like to dedicate the next few years, the next decade, the next 2 decades of my life doing. It's a for-profit business. We call it doing well by doing good. Bringing renewable energy to the poorest people on the planet, helping them to develop economically, helping to serve and to answer some of the pressing humanitarian needs of the poorest countries in Africa. Promoting women's empowerment, of course, environmental issues and what have you, but to do it in such a way that is profitable for investors and scalable. That's something that I said to myself, you know what, I think I want to try and focus on that. And I set myself some other career goals, including going back to the issue of Israel advocacy, to rededicate kind of to a wider swath of the world, all of those elements, audiences that I just mentioned, beyond the media, academics, political leadership, church leadership, and the like, to reassert the legitimacy of Israel, to reassert the founding principles and the justification and the justice of the cause of the Jews returning to our ancestral homeland. And to do so, you need to be able to argue. You need to be able to advocate and to articulate some of the historical realities which too few people actually even talk about these days. So that was another thing that I set for myself as a goal. But as we wind down this half-an-hour segment, I want to share with you the most important element of my walk here along the Yarkon. And it's much more personal. And that is, I kind of hinted to it earlier, having gone through this process of reaching a certain humility and acceptance that this is my reality, I'm divorced, and gratitude for all the blessings that I have been blessed with in my life, and reaching a heartfelt level of forgiveness of my former wife. I then was open to the possibility of loving again. And as I walked along here on the Yarkon, I came across a small tree stump where apparently some thoughtful Tel Aviv municipal worker with a budget for gardening had planted, they weren't wild, planted the most beautiful array of colored flowers. I'm going to stick that photo in here because it's so important, and so important to me and to my story. It was on a tree stump which showed, and as I come up here, it's not a tree stump, it's a trash receptacle, but I'm going to stand next to this with the sign of the trail sign there. And I want you to imagine coming along a tree stump with the sign of the trail there, with these beautiful, beautiful spring flowers having been planted, which I just enjoyed because it was so full of life. It was so indicative to me of rebirth and renewal in the spring. And just as I was watching it, I'm going to interrupt myself here for a second. I'm going to show you, here I am on the trail with the trail sign. For those of you listening on the radio and not watching, I just kneeled down to show the trail sign as we're walking along the Yarkon. And now I'm going to put in the photo of the tree stump with these flowers. So the most miraculous, just marvelous thing happened as I stopped to take that photo of the tree stump. There were two doves, turtle doves, I guess, pigeons, doves, what have you, white doves that were flitting around in the air above these. And they were following each other, and they came to land, both of them, on the tree stump with the flowers. And I looked at them, and it suddenly occurred to me, I thought it was an urban myth, but when I wrote my book, I looked it up, and it turns out, yes, doves mate for life. And it occurred to me looking at them, they can stay together for life, and we couldn't. It could have been a melancholy moment, but it wasn't. For some reason, something clicked inside me. I admired their stick-withedness. I admired the symbol of love and commitment. And I looking at these flowers, this symbol of spring, I said to myself, I'm ready. I really believe. I have a certain confidence. I wasn't sure, of course, but I have a certain confidence that I will love again. I almost texted my kids at that point. Hey, I just realized I can love again. And I'm thankful, and I'm sure they are too, that I didn't, because that would have been, I think, a little bit too much, because they weren't with me in the thought processes that led to that sort of declaration. But I did recognize it in myself. And of course, those of you who have followed along in these conversations in the last 10 weeks know I cried. I'm one of those guys who's not embarrassed at crying or admitting. And I cried because they were tears of joy and happiness and relief and release, because I knew at that point I will love again. I didn't know, but I felt that at least it was possible. And that possibility to me meant so much in terms of my ability to literally move on with my life. Now, we have to close, but I'll leave to next week a discussion of kind of a summary and a conclusion. But what I do want to share with you, and I'll throw a picture in here towards the end if she allows me, is that just a year later, after hiking the trail, after reaching that revelation, if you will, that I was capable of loving again, I did meet, or I would say, she actually found me, my Miriam. And we were married, we fell in love, and were married in August of 2015, a year and a half or so after my hiking the Israel Trail, a year and a few months after walking here along the Yarkon and recognizing that that was possible. And there are no coincidences in this world. I'm going to show you a backdrop right now of a small bridge over the Yarkon where I'm finishing this recording. And if you look closely, you can see that on the bridge, for whatever reason, there are little hearts on the railing of the bridge. And I think that's a wonderful way of ending our conversation for today. Thank you for joining me. I hope that it has been enjoyable. This has been segment 10 of Tales from the Trail, and I hope you join me next time. I'm Aryeh Green, author of My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Promised Land.
להתהלך בארץ בתרמיל ובמקל, וודאי תפגוש בדרך שוב את ארץ ישראל. יחבקו אותך דרכיה של הארץ הטובה,